Thank you for staying with us. So, that's our first topic this morning, tackling unresolved corruption cases. I mean, if you Google that one alone, unresolved corruption cases in Nigeria, you come up with a number of things. But you know, the EFCC, for instance, has investigated 31 state governors for corruption and taken 11 of them to court. But the agency has recorded only 2 convictions. 31 investigations, 11 prosecuted, 2 convictions, both of whom were pardoned without completing their sentences. The former CBN governor is the latest former public official that is being prosecuted, but will there be a quick resolution to this case, or there is more to it, as the pundits are suggesting? The Human and Environmental Development Agenda Header Resource Center in its compendium titled Impunity Galore, a chronicle of some unresolved high-profile corruption cases in Nigeria from 1999 to 2022 highlighted cases of national importance that have been ignored or poorly investigated by the EFCC and other anti-graft agencies, as well as the National Assembly ad hoc and joint committees responsible for investigating allegations of corruption. That compendium says the cases involve a staggering total of $825 billion. Yes, dollars. Again, pick up your calculator, multiply. That's what you have in Naira. Let's have this conversation this morning. We have quite a panel of guests, but let's begin with Mr. Wahab Shitu with us here in the studio. He's a senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you again for inviting me.
You know, the first thing that comes to my mind about this is, I just did a quick Google search and I saw, a list of unresolved, forgotten, that's the way the newspaper put it, forgotten corruption cases in Nigeria. Per government, what's your assessment of our fight against corruption?
Well, I think I can describe it as a motion without movement. I may also say that there's a distinction in this fight against corruption between oratory and practical action. We need to make up our mind whether we identify corruption as a major elephant in the room, and whether we are prepared as a country to confront that elephant, whether we are really sincere about fighting corruption.
So with the number of particularly anti-corruption agencies in the country, you don't see any concerted effort to fight corruption?
Well, in theory, and some modest practical efforts, which are not far-reaching enough. Because you have these agencies that you have alluded to, there must be the political will to actually strengthen these agencies to combat corruption.
My apologies, Mr. Shitu. I'm abashed each time I hear political will. I say that because the agencies are not some euphoric ideas that we have. They are set up by law. There are legislations, rigorously paid for legislative processes that went into making those laws. Agencies were set up to execute those laws. What then do we need a political will for?
Well, we need the political will because in spite of these agencies that you have alluded to, in spite of the legislative framework in place to fight corruption that you have also alluded to, much depends on the body language of the leadership and the willingness of the leadership to allow these agencies to effectively work without interference.
Is that a standard body language? Because we are essentially, it sounds to me like we're making excuses for agencies not to do their job, and we are giving unnecessary power or authority to individuals in the polity.
Well, these agencies are determined to do their work. I'm happy that the current National Security Advisor was the pioneer chairman of Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. And everybody saw the passion with which Nurubadu fought corruption in this country and how he was eventually frustrated, how he was eventually maligned, and how he was eventually, chased out of office in spite of his lofty intentions. Because the reality of our country is that we have vested interests. And these vested interests are very powerful. If you want to fight corruption, then you must also contend with the reality that corruption also has a tendency of fighting back. There are countries that have made a lot of giant strides in the fight against corruption. I want to identify Denmark, for instance. Why have they succeeded? It's because the leadership, you see, the last administration, for instance, came out forcefully with an agenda to fight corruption. But what happened eventually? The arrowhead of the anti-corruption fight, Ibrahim Magu, who was the chairman of EFCC, was actually frustrated out of office without any cogent, compelling reason. When you begin to, when the chair of the anti-corruption fight is on the hot seat, he's allegedly he's frustrated out of office for no compelling reason, because some people felt he was stepping on toes. I've been involved, like I said, in this at the level of prosecution since the advent of EFCC. So if I'm talking, I'm talking with some measure of authority. I think we must face the reality that we need to fight corruption in our country and then take proactive measures.
Okay.
To ensure that agenda
that the fight is
realized. Yes. Yes.
Well, Mr. Ashley Emenike has also joined us this morning. He's former governorship candidate to River State. He's also advisor to the immediate past chair Senate Committee on Anti-Corruption and Financial Crimes. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Mr. Emenike. Well, we began by
It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we began by just asking questions around whether or not in the country we are poised to fight corruption, or it's just one of those sing-songs that sound like something the people want to hear. From your experience, particularly being counsel to, offering advice to the Senate Committee on Anti-Corruption and Financial Crimes, what would you say? Would you say that we have a deft commitment to fighting corruption, or it's just a sing-song?
Well, I don't think we really have a choice. We have to fight corruption, whether there's a body language to fight it or not, because it's killing the country. Like I keep saying, we're bleeding ourselves to death.
I get that, Mr. Emenike. Just one moment. Just one moment. We have to. Yes. That's why we're here. But do you think hitherto it's just a sing-song from government, or there are some deliberate actions that have been taken or are being taken to ensure that corruption is fought?
Definitely, there have been very serious, deliberate actions that have been taken. Some are in public domain and some are not. I'm very aware from the proximity within which I worked, especially with the Ninth Assembly. I'm working closely with the anti-graft agencies. There have been massive volumes of recoveries in billions, And you don't get to hear these ones because they are possibly done by virtue of, plea bargaining, compoundment. And one of the biggest successes or the targets we need to face is to deprive a looter of his proceeds. And that has been done, but it's not enough. We need to do more. We need to commend civil society organizations. Without them, many of these incidents would have gone unheard, unseen, unknown. For example, what HEDA has been doing, what SERAP has been doing, and several other civil society bodies. We commend them, but we need to go further. In as much as we need to resolve the myriad of corruption cases that are there, I think we should focus as well on the prevention of corruption. There must have been an auditor or an audit trail that would enable volumes of cash to be moved out of the national treasury. What happened to those auditors? What happens to the compliance regime in banks when somebody is moving billions and billions, is lodging checks, 50 million naira checks, 10 every day for every single day for a month. So there are issues we need to look at, not just in fighting the corruption, but in prevention. When we're fighting, in the fight and the issue of unresolved corruption cases, it has to be a tripartite effort. The judiciary, even if they want to fight and make pronouncements and send people to jail, deprive them of their illicit gains, there has to be a very, a high level of quality of investigation that will enable the prosecutor to come to court. And then, and you also have to look at the executive, preventing corruption within their systems. And then you look at the legislature who will keep, the legislations are living documents. We'll keep amending. When we see any loophole, we amend. And that's just about the process of fighting corruption. But recently, I'm quite happy to notice that the Central Bank of Nigeria, calling recourse to their CBN Act and the BOFIA. They've released some circular for commercial banks, another non-commercial banks and financial institutions on corporate governance. And that is the key. What we're suffering today is a failure of corporate governance. And I'm pleased to inform you that I've been in very close touch with the Compliance Institute of Nigeria, and they are trying to charter their body so that we have compliance officers in banks ensuring that there are no irregular activities. You have and that's what that's one of the provisions of this new release circular by Central Bank.
Well, Mr. Menike, perhaps that also raises the question, first of all, of whether or not such circulars or regulations had been effective hitherto. Practically, every bank customer who goes into any bank will see that sign that you're supposed to report X amount of transaction, that the bank has that duty to report the transaction to the EFCC and all of that. So long as it crosses, the moment it crosses a particular threshold, you're supposed to report it. How effective was that hitherto? Because there are those who believe that that law it selects a number of people and doesn't, it exempts some, it doesn't exempt some.
Well, truth be told, the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit is supposed to be receiving the suspicious transaction reports, cash transaction reports, and then disseminate the same to the anti-graft and law enforcement agencies. Now, the feedback, the report back, what did they do with those transaction reports, and were those STRs given within the stipulated time limit? I've had cause to send messages to maybe even the NFIU. You need to deploy technology, leaving the human intervention to identify thresholds that raise the eyebrows and say, look, this transaction is suspicious. and then leaving that to a human element. I think we've gone beyond that.
Okay.
There's AI, there's artificial intelligence, there are technologies that can track, monitor those breaches and then send the reports automatically to generate those reports and disseminate them to relevant intervention anti-graft agencies and law enforcement agencies.
Okay.
And
well,
if they do that, it will help in the fight.
Okay. Well, there's an issue I raised with Mr. Shitu, and I'll come back to him right quick. But from your own experience as well, one of the things we were discussing is the vulnerability of the agencies of government that are supposed to fight corruption, particularly the heads of these agencies. Excuse me. I remember when the Olusegun Obasanjo government came into power in 1999, the number one corruption agency it set up was the ICPC. And for whatever reason, we began to hear some noises about that ICPC, and it kind of lost its teeth at some point. And immediately after that, not too long after that, the EFCC came on board. And so far, even the EFCC itself has been embroiled in one issue or the other. And Mr. Shitu was just telling us that he is well aware of the fact that it would seem like the leadership of these agencies are vulnerable one way or the other. I suspect you might want to agree with him. If you do, what would you say are these vulnerabilities? Because I know, just as you said, you work not only with the security agencies, you've also worked with Senate committee as well. So what are the vulnerabilities of these agencies?
I think the vulnerabilities sometimes are self-made. You know, when you expose yourself as a chief executive of an anti-graft agency or a law enforcement agency, and you need to differentiate, there are two different bodies, and they operate separately. And especially the anti-graft agencies should subject themselves to corporate governance. And like I said, it is the failure of corporate governance that has led to the loopholes that have been taken advantage of by people who are, you know, perpetuating money laundering, illicit financial flows, as well as issues to do with financial terrorism. So, and we were of the school of thought that the anti-graft institutions should have internal corporate governance and still be independent. But the CEOs of the anti-corruption agencies tend to sometimes interpret their activities as that of law enforcement. And we have a different opinion in that they have police powers only when they're investigating or when they are prosecuting. But outside that, they don't have police powers. So what do? Internal corporate governance. You have a chief executive and you have somebody who is in charge of the day-to-day administrative.
Let me pause you there one moment,
agency.
Mr. Emenike. The issue you just raised now, my apologies. The issue you just raised now, I think Mr. Shitu might want to respond to it. I'm pretty sure you heard everything that he said along the line of the vulnerabilities. One of them being that the CEOs of these anti-graft agencies expose themselves. How do you respond to that, and then and any other thing you may want to respond?
Well, I'm not in a position to speak for the chief executives of these agencies. Everybody has to answer his father's name. But what I'm certain about is that we need to allow these agencies to actually function in line with their mandate. For instance, EFCC, ICPC, all of these agencies are supposed to be regulated by enabling enactments. And so we should deal with these agencies in line with their enabling enactments. Secondly, we should have an attorney general who is ready to also cooperate with these agencies in allowing them to achieve their own mandate. I think my approach to all of this is respect for the rule of law. These agencies are created by law. We must insist that they follow the law. And where they deviate from the law, of course, there should be consequences. I'm favoring a rule of law approach in the fight against corruption. Yes, corruption is It's the elephant in the room that we all identify. But there's no way you say in the guise of fighting corruption that you neglect the fundamental principle of respect for the rule of law. So if, for instance, we want to deal with these agencies in terms of infractions, deal with them in accordance with the law setting them up. EFCC as EFCC Act. ICPC, for instance, is also regulated by law. So where we leave law aside and allow vested interests to take over is what I quarrel with. I don't. Human beings will always be human beings. You understand me?
Yeah.
But when you have statutory provisions, statutory guidelines, a legal framework for combating, for regulating your affairs, you don't go outside that legal framework to deal with any given problem or deal with any executive.
We've had about 4 or 5 heads of the EFCC now, and each one of them has been forced to leave office one way or the other. None of them has ever said, okay, I resign, or okay, my tenure is over, and all of those things. Maybe we should even begin with that. Is there a tenure determined for the head of the EFCC?
Of course. If you look at Section 2.3 of the EFCC Act,
Yeah.
a chief executive of EFCC, chairman of EFCC, is supposed to be there for 4 years.
Okay.
Renewable.
Okay, so that's at least about 8 years in total.
Yes.
Now, in the light of the fact that not a single one of them has ever seen to the end of his tenure, even the first term, I don't know of any one of them that has ever spent up to 44 years. If there is, you can help us. How come each one of them has had to leave office on such controversial grounds?
I think
The
question you should ask is, if I may rephrase that question, is that there must be consequences for infractions. So if all the chief executives of EFCC that have left office with controversial circumstances, how many of them have been prosecuted? None. And if you have not prosecuted anybody, it means that you have not really found any justification for easing them out of office. I'm saying the law should be applied, no matter whose source is guilty. For instance, you recall that I defended the former chairman of EFCC in the proceeding before Salami panel. Have you asked what is the outcome of that panel proceedings? Why was Magu removed from office? Is it for corruption? Has any corruption been established against him? So if you are unable to establish corruption against someone that you have put in the public space as having enriched himself, then what is the justification for expending public resources on a supposed probe? And what's the outcome? If there's a commission of inquiry, is that commission of inquiry not supposed to turn in a report? And if a report is turned in,
Sorry.
are we not entitled to have a white paper on that report? Up till now, as I speak, nothing has happened.
So shouldn't...
And thereafter, the same person was promoted as AIG. So what I'm saying is this. What is the reason for removing Nuhu Ribadu, for instance? No reason, other than the fact that the man was fighting corruption with passion. And the best example of that is that today is the National Security Advisor of this regime. If you were somebody of questionable character, will you rise to that level? Will you promote Magu if he was actually guilty of corruption to AIG? Where was Farida East out and some other people like that? None of them has been prosecuted, which shows that they were victimized out of office. So what I'm saying is that without holding brief for anybody, even when you want to fight corruption, the fight against corruption must be holistic, sparing nobody. So the fact that you are the chairman of EFCC does not excuse your conduct if you are also running foul of the law. And so we must insist on the rule of law in the fight against corruption, whether the person involved is the chairman of EFCC or a common man like me. You understand me? We must apply the rules whether the person is rich or poor. It's not that when you find a poor man loitering in the night, you accuse him of wandering. And if he's a rich man, you say he's simply taking a stroll. No! There must be.
What rules, my apologies for putting in,
Yes.
what rule would you say, what rule of law would you say has been breached by the actions of whatever level of government so far in the cases, in the suggested cases that you're talking about?
The rule of law that has been breached is lack of fair hearing.
But there was a panel set up.
A panel was set up, for instance. Now, that panel proceeded initially as an investigative panel. The terms of reference of that panel was not even released to the panel until 3 months after its sitting. The panel was not even aware that it was supposed to be a commission of inquiry. A lot of breaches took place in the trial of Magu. The man was just humiliated out of office without justification. You understand me? And it's not Magu alone. Where was the circumstances surrounding the exit of Nuhu Ribadu from EFCC? You all know that Nuhu Ribadu fought corruption in this country with passion. He was committed. He was fearless. He was incorruptible. In spite of all that, there's no way you can talk of the successes recorded by EFCC today without reference to Nuhu Ribadu. In spite of that, the vested interest elements crept in.
Okay.
And the man was eased out of office. That was a bad precedent.
Absolutely.
So I think what we should insist upon is that, yes, we must fight corruption. What approach do you want to deploy in the fight against corruption? Do we want to fight corruption in the context of respect for the rule of law, which I advocate for? That would mean that you don't adopt the policy of arrest-led investigation. Rather, you investigate first thoroughly before you go and arrest somebody.
Okay. Mr.
So
Menike,
a lot of approaches have to change.
Absolutely.
If we want to really fight corruption.
Yeah. Mr. Menike, you've listened to these things, and, one of the questions that's still on my mind is that of, when you speak about the vulnerability, you've listened to him, to Mr. Shitu speak about these things, and I have raised questions, for instance, along the line of, because we can say that part of the institutions of fighting corruption in Nigeria is this Senate committee to which you were also advisor on anti-corruption and financial crimes. Would you say they are also vulnerable because the fight against corruption, or the fighting back of corruption against anti-corruption, it's definitely not just towards one agency of government. I suspect it might also be holistic as well.
Well, let me just clarify the issues when I mentioned the vulnerability. The act itself makes the chairman, not just the chief executive officer, but as well as the chief accounting officer, and that's where the problem comes from. So he has to account for everything. But if you follow corporate governance guidelines, you should have a chief executive being the chairman of EFCC or ICPC or NFIU. Then you should have a secretary to the board who will probably be the equivalent of a permanent secretary to a federal minister or to a commissioner who is the accounting officer. That way, there will be checks and balances in terms of things you can do as a chief executive and things you cannot do. And then there's a fallback. So the secretary to the board acts as a buffer. There should be no fear, or there's no space for clashing, because the chairman is the chairman, the chief executive is the chief executive, the PAMSEC or the secretary to the board cannot do anything without the authorization of the chief executive. So if we can institute that corporate governance where the secretaries to the commissions or to the agencies become the accounting officers, while the chief executive takes, of course, becomes and plays that role where he doesn't have to sit on the tenders board, where he doesn't have to get involved in award of contracts. That has been where they always get roped in. Oh, you were involved in this, you were involved in that. But if there was an accounting officer, it's him that they're supposed to hold. And then now you look at all the myriad of cases that are still pending. What do we do with them? The three arms of government need to sit down together and say, look, we need to solve these problems. We need to, put an end. There must be an end to all these things. One, for the executives, the agencies, make sure, like the speaker had just mentioned, do not arrest and then investigate. Make sure your investigations are thorough. Then you give that investigation, it goes to your legal department, and that legal department's opinion should be listened to. Don't get carried away with political games. Is this investigation outcome, is it possible for you to go to court? How many of those legal opinions are looked into? And then, did they follow the legal opinion before they started prosecution? And then again, comes the issue of the enabling legislations.
Just one moment,
our legal
Mr.
framework
Menike.
is
Just one moment.
Yes.
On that issue that you just raised now, when you're talking about those processes and offices that ought to be respected within the anti-graft agencies, it suggests to me that those are some of the vulnerabilities in the entire process.
And as well accountable to the public. But the chief executives will probably think, oh, you're going to tamper with my independence. No. The independence of an agency is not woven around the chief executive. It's woven around the institution. EFCC should be independent, but the staffers, the management and the staff should be subject to the corporate governance of that institution. And I must give kudos to the the EFCC. They have a whole set of SOPs that guide every single thing that they do, and that is commendable, and that should be copied by other anti-graft agencies.
Okay.
But then, because the independence is important within the agency, not the individual, the other thing is funding. Okay. How do we improve the funding?
Okay, let me ask
another issue.
Yes.
And then I need to just land on this one.
Okay.
The Proceeds of Crime Act created a percentage to be, set back from recoveries to enable the agencies have extra funds to perform their duties. I just wanted to mention that when I came to funding.
Thank you, Mr. Menike. Well, you've listened to him as well, yeah. And I saw that a number of times, a number of issues that he's raising, you are agreeing, that some of those things seem to be done.
Of course, he's speaking from very informed perspectives, and what he has said is correct. These are part of the things there's no way an institution can function without adherence to corporate governance best practices.
Would you say that the agencies have done that so far?
I think EFCC is trying to do that. I think there are frameworks in place now to address that, and which he has also alluded to. Other agencies can also copy from that.
So we can say then that, my apologies, is it safe to say then that is one of the vulnerabilities or the slippery slopes that these agencies have fallen to over time?
Definitely. Like I said, I'm not here to speak to hold brief for anybody. But what I'm saying is that there are best practices for fighting corruption.
Anywhere in the world?
Anywhere in the world.
Now, would you then be calling for a review of the laws? Because unless that is done, all these suggestions that Mr. Menike is making, I don't see.
Of course, these laws have to be reviewed. Again, we also have to adhere to best practices in the fight against corruption. We also must take a strategic decision whether indeed we want to fight corruption. It's not important.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because that's the first question that I asked.
Yes.
Mr. Menike, stand by, you will also respond to that. That's the first question that I asked.
Yes.
In 1999, since 1999 to date, the Header Resource Report says 1.6 trillion naira and $825 billion of corruption cases have been unresolved since 1999 until last year, 2022. So if we wanted to fight corruption, and I don't know the resources of all of these cases that the Header Resource Center is talking about, but I have looked at the Auditor General's report since, I think, 2015. There have been vulnerabilities of ministries, departments, and agencies over time. They are unable to account consummately or totally to some of these, to some financial gaps in their organizations. So if we are going to fight corruption, what has been missing that needs to be tightened?
Well, first of all, I alluded to it at the beginning of this discussion. There must be the political will by the leadership that we want to fight, not just in theory, not just oratory, because there must be leadership example that we need. First of all, we must have anti-corruption policy that spells out the objectives of the government in fighting corruption.
You don't think we have that?
For instance, a lot of work has been done. Let me admit, the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, led by Professor Sage, did a lot of extensive work, made a lot of recommendations to government. The question is, have those recommendations been implemented? It's a Sage. Did a lot of work, that committee, set up by the last administration. Have the recommendations been implemented? The answer is no. The fight against corruption largely has been dictated by whims and caprices of the ruling elite. Whereas we must have rules, procedures, standards in place. When you are talking of corruption, it's not just a stealing of money that constitutes corruption. When you are talking of corruption, you are talking of a general breakdown. A breakdown in systems, a breakdown in institutions, a breakdown in societal traditions, a breakdown in ethical and moral values, a breakdown in personal behaviors. So it's a holistic thing.
Which leads me to the states.
Yes. Now the thing we need to do,
yes,
we have mentioned, we need to have an anti-corruption policy that will spell out the objectives of the government. Government must key in to the anti-corruption agenda.
Federal or state?
Governments at all levels. Governments at all levels, institutions at all levels. They must key in. In my own view, I would say we are determined to fight corruption in theory. In practical times, we have not shown enough determination, enough commitment.
Okay.
And the single most potent factor militating against our developmental efforts is this elephant in the room called corruption. Perhaps the one that is greater than it, that this corruption is the factor of impunity. So if we determine that we want to fight corruption, then we must deploy the political will. We must fund it. They must be adequately funded. Most of these agencies are underfunded. For instance, you want to fight corruption, if you look at developed countries, they want to fight corruption, they can use 500 million, for instance, to chase a corrupt activity of 5 million. You need to employ the best lawyers and pay them well.
Okay.
You understand me?
Yeah.
Investigation has to be thorough. Prosecution has to be effective and efficient. Adjudication has to be effective and efficient. I also believe that it's high time we start looking into some novel frameworks. If you are talking of prosecution, for instance, there must be a time limit. Electoral matters, for instance, we know that it's 180 days. I recommend that in the prosecution of corruption, we should set a time limit.
Okay.
And then get our best to be involved.
Prosecute. Okay.
We are not ready because we are not even funding it.
Well, Mr. Benike, what would be your own suggestion? And please focus on what the states, the gaps in the states, because quite a number of people still point to the fact that the state governments themselves are having a hard time. There's a lot of corrupt practices in some states as well. What would be your own recommendations in that regard?
Well, as a country, we do have a national, what they call the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. With the first phase of that was 2017 to 2022. It is lapsed. There's a NACS2, National Anti-Corruption Strategy Phase 2. That is awaiting implementation, and it's in the Office of the Attorney General. And one of the issues that was thrown up in reviewing the first phase of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy were the monitoring, evaluation, and then implementation. How do you implement these strategies, the different things in terms of prevention and things like that? Now, it was very clear that there was a gap between the federal and the states and the local government in terms of implementation of this National Anti-Corruption Strategy. How do you cascade down the issues of prevention, issues of whistleblowing, issues of witness protection? And the laws are there in different aspects. But now, in implementing the second phase, there are some states now who have equivalents of anti-corruption agencies. Kano State is one, and some other states have enacted their own state-level anti-graft agencies. But the problem that needs to be solved is the state houses of assembly have the powers to make laws and appropriate funds for the working of the state governments. And same thing with the local government, even the local government councils. And should a federal agency set up by federal law have power to inquire without invitation, the execution and how the appropriated funds are looked into? That has been subject to litigation. I think it's still yet to be resolved. I'm aware that some state governments, when they are invited by federal anti-graft agencies, they say, "I'm sorry, we can't come. You don't have any business because you're a federal agency dealing with federal laws. We deal with our own laws, unless, of course, the State House of Assembly invites you. You don't really have any business here." So that strategy, the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, coming down to the state, then going to local government, that has been the challenge, and we need to solve it. One of the areas proposed in solving this gap was the putting together of a body called the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, GOPAC. And GOPAC is for all parliamentarians. It has executive, it has federal legislators, it has state legislators, and of course the equivalents are the local government councils. And through that body, they can be encouraged to enact anti-graft legislations and, of course, conduct vigilant oversight on expenditures of the executive arms of their government. And if that can be done, and if all the stakeholders put pressure on the Office of the Attorney General, let's start implementing the second phase of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. That will be a way forward. And one of the things is funding. Who's going to fund it? The Attorney General is supposed to create an anti-corruption funding strategy framework. That hasn't been done. And once that is done, you will now have a pool within which to use to implement the National Anti-Corruption Strategy Phase 2. Okay.
Well, gentlemen, we're running off in about 2 minutes or less. But so your final words, Mr. Shitu, how do we insulate corruption, anti-corruption officials, not just the agencies now, anti-corruption officials? How do we insulate them from being corrupted themselves?
The answer is the fight against corruption should not be left in the hands of the anti-corruption agencies alone. So if I am to answer your question directly, I will say monitoring. You and I can monitor them. The public can monitor them. They are public servants.
But there has to be a reporting channel.
Yes, I'm saying that when you see something, when something is wrong, you see something, you say something, and you do something. You don't say because EFCC and ICPC are set up, they are the only ones statutorily empowered to fight corruption. It's everybody's business.
Absolutely.
Of course, in our country, it's either we want to have a country devoid of corruption or want to have a corrupt-ridden country.
Okay. Well, Mr. Menike, your final words on the same issue. How do we insulate the officials within the anti-corruption agencies from corruption themselves?
Well, we're enacting, the National Assembly, I believe the 10th Assembly, will be looking at the issues of the whistleblowing framework. The last night assembly tried to put that within the Public Complaints Commission. One of the problems we have in putting new agencies is funding. Already we're overloaded with too many agencies. Our science report needs to be, even the white paper and all the committee findings, they need to look into it and know how many of these agencies are actually viable and then review them. So the way forward would be, let's look at the way the whistle is being blown, so to speak. If you encounter an anti-graft staff, agent, and you have a problem. I know the EFCC has what they call the eagle eye, something like that, yes. There should be that whistleblowing thing within the Public Complaints Commission. And there's a reason why we decided that at the Ninth Assembly, put it within the Public Complaints Commission, because they already have offices all over the country, in every state, in every local government. So instead of creating a new agency with new startup money, they're already there. And I believe the 10th Assembly would look at implementing, trying to legislate and put the whistleblowing, so that if there's any evidence of corruption or any staff of the LEAs or the anti-corruption agencies trying to, abuse his office, you simply blow the whistle. Of course, there's also a witness protection bill that's also going to be put together in the 10th Assembly. But on my final note, the myriad of cases that are still pending, the executive, and I have this quiet optimism about this new administration, the executive and the judiciary and the legislature need to come together. How do we clean out these cases?
That's another.
The lawyers.
That's another
page. Objections.
Yeah, Mr. Menike, that sounds like another page altogether that you are opening in this conversation this morning. But I guess we'll have to leave that for another time. Ashley Menike, former governorship candidate, Rivers State, and advisor to the immediate past chair, Senate Committee on Anti-Corruption and Financial Crimes, as well as Mr. Wahab Shitu, senior advocate of Nigeria. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning.
It's my pleasure.
I truly appreciate the effort you made to be here. Well, Sunrise continues right after now with another topic. This one is a lot closer home. Stay with us.